The thing about in vitro fertilization, which is IVF, is that it's a very, very abortive or a highly abortive technology. It's a technology that is designed to create life by destroying it.
Once people understand the reasons for the church's teaching, they will see that church is not trying to make people miserable, not trying to forbid people from having some great joy in life that they would like to have, but they're trying to protect some very important values.
The end might be very good, and I don't think anyone disagrees with couples trying to achieve a pregnancy, to have a child, but the question becomes the means.
As Catholic faithful, it is our responsibility to educate ourselves on the teachings of the Church and to reflect those values in our lives. This can be difficult, but the Church provides us with guidance for navigating the many complex issues we face in today's world. When it comes to issues relating to human life and reproduction, there are three primary documents that we look to for guidance. The first is Humana Vitae, which is Latin for of human life. It's an encyclical written by Pope Paul VI and released in 1968. Primarily, it reaffirms the traditional teachings regarding abortion, contraception, and other issues pertaining to human life. The second, Donum Vitae, was issued in 1987 as an update to Humana Vitae. The document specifically discusses in vitro fertilization and why the Church is opposed to its use. And finally, Dignitas Personae was released in 2008 to address specific ethical questions that had arisen since 1987. Together, these documents provide explanations of many teachings relating to the dignity of new human life. Couples facing infertility often look toward in vitro fertilization as a solution, without even realizing that it violates the teachings of the Church. With a little background and evaluation, the Church's reasons for opposing IVF become very clear.
Many people, even some of the priests, perceive the Church's teaching on IVF as kind of negative, right? You have all these unfortunate people who are very desperate to have a child. And of course the Church is very pro-child. Purpose of marriage is to create a family. And so the deep desire that people have in their hearts to have a child is extremely natural and extremely good. I mean, it's people really wanting to have a concrete physical manifestation of their love, an incarnation. The two have really become one through having a child. And of course they want to support God in His effort to bring forth new souls. And God devised sexuality in the family precisely for that purpose. So now in our culture we seem to have a rising incidence of infertility. Women who get into their 30s, sometimes even their 40s, they haven't had children, they really desperately want children. They don't seem to be able to have children naturally. So they turn to artificial technologies, artificial insemination, in vitro fertilization. And the Church says they shouldn't be using this. And I sort of look at the Church and say, what's wrong with you? I'm trying to do a good thing. I'm trying to have a baby. So you always have to find a moral way to meet a problem rather than an immoral way. And that's what the Church is trying to help us do.
Sexual activity, from the perspective of the Catholic Church, should be between a man and a woman, and there should be unitive and procreative aspects to that. And that is really the only way that procreation should occur. So in order for IVF to occur, first of all, an egg has to be harvested from a woman. Then the sperm has to be harvested from the man. If you collect the sperm and then you put it into a petri dish with an egg for fertilization to occur, what you have then done is removed a biological act and made it more of a laboratory act. And so that violates the Church teaching on how conception should occur.
The real fact is the child is not the direct result of an act of lovemaking between the spouses. And that's what the Church requires. It has to be an overflow of that love, not the skill of the technician.
The Church teaches us that on the most basic of levels, in vitro fertilization violates her message for how conception should occur. The miracle of creating life is a gift from God that should only take place in marriage. This fundamental teaching is essential to protect the dignity of the child. It reminds us to always respect and value new life, even before conception has taken place.
The Church sees a deep connection between marriage, parenthood, and the good of the child. Married couples, as it were, by getting married, make themselves fit. They render themselves capable, as it were, of not only engaging in sexual activity, but being able to provide that child with a proper home.
God did this beautiful thing of making male and female love each other, and then through an act of sex which allows them actually physically to become one, that through that very act, new life can come to be. New life is meant to come to be within marriage because it's meant to be, in a sense, this overflow of love between the spouses. And it completes them. It's the sort of sense like they really want to be together, they want to be together for a lifetime, and in a sense they want something to do together. And raising a child together is the most natural thing, to be the joint project of two people who love each other, because they brought together this new life. Now all of their values, all of their skills, all of their energies can be directed towards trying to help this new little human being be everything the parents want to help it become. So there's a beautiful way in which babies in marriage make perfect sense. So that the IVF, though, again, in a sense, takes it outside of marriage. It says we're willing to buy sperm, we're willing to buy egg, we're going to hire a technician. And it's not an overflow of this love. Instead, it's a commercial product with a technician involved.
Well, the Church would see this technology as basically separating the unitive value of marital intercourse from the procreative aspect. It's essentially trying to have babies without sex. And so the end might be very good. And I don't think anyone disagrees with couples trying to achieve a pregnancy, to have a child. But the question becomes the means.
Every human being, again, is made of the father's sperm and the mother's egg. But it really has to be God that gives the soul to the human being, because it's an immortal soul. And the sperm doesn't have an immortal soul. The egg doesn't have an immortal soul. You say, where'd it get it? It had to be from God. So procreating, creating means making something out of nothing. So God, when he creates a soul, it's not like he takes a part of his own being and makes a new soul. He actually, there was nothing, and now there's a new soul. And he gives this to the new little human being. So now that couples are actually helping God bring into life a new human being. They're doing so by engaging in an act of lovemaking, where the sperm meets the egg, which is an invitation to God to create a new human soul. When you're understanding that this new human being couldn't come to be except through an act of God, then you see this new human being as a gift. Whereas if you make it in a petri dish, right, it seems like that God is involved there too, but it seems like you've done it. You've put the sperm together, you've put the egg together in a certain sense, and God does create a new human soul. But then you're going to toss out the ones that you don't think are valuable. So it's no longer a gift, it's like a product, again, that I've made with the help of God. But if I think it's not up to my standards of quality control, I'm going to toss out these new little human beings.
The means, in a sense, reduces the child to a thing, to an object, to something we manufacture or make. And the Church says that we are not to make babies, we are to procreate them.
Not only does in vitro fertilization disregard how God intends us to procreate, it fundamentally changes how we think about children. Many people think that the Church stands against IVF because it relies on technology. In actuality, the Church supports technology, but is opposed to this specific use of technology.
Couples coming together in the marital embrace to create a child with God is a person-to-person act. Whereas when couples have recourse to in vitro fertilization or some other artificial reproductive technology, what's going on there is not a person-to-person act. It's not an interpersonal act at all, but it's an act of making. It's an act of technology. And what we're finding is more and more today in our modern world, we have science taking control of the procreative process, the process of reproduction. And this seems to be turning procreation into an act of technological making, rather than it remaining in the marriage, a marital act, bringing a child into existence. Naturally, what we have here is the supremacy of science over the generation of new human life.
A lot of people make the mistake of thinking that the church is against these technologies because they're technological or they're artificial. Right? And the church makes it a couple times in the document Donum Vitae, it speaks very clearly and says that it's not because they're artificial, and it's not because there's a technician involved in some respect in the act. The church says that technology or art that restores nature or brings nature back to its proper functioning is a good use of technology. For instance, I have eyeglasses then, because obviously my eyesight is imperfect. So what do my eyeglasses do? They restore me to a properly seeing level. So the church very much approves of any technology that helps restore the fertility to couples. But what you're trying to do is to restore each individual so that they can engage in a proper act of lovemaking, and that the child is the direct result of that lovemaking. So the technology can be used to restore nature and to facilitate nature, not to replace nature, and certainly not to violate nature.
I don't think people think through it, and I don't think people even think of it as an ethical issue, because it has been so destigmatized and so mainstream. So in our culture, which is all about control, what I do see is this. A couple may be living together, or they may be married, and they're not prepared to have a child. So they'll use oral contraceptive agents, IUD, or something of that sort, to keep them from having a child. Then they decide they want to have a child. They have the nursery set up, they have the college fund started, they're prepared to have a family, so they stop their oral contraceptive pill, they take out their IUD, and they expect 1 month later to be pregnant. And then 6 months later, they're not there. What's wrong? How could this occur? They thought they had everything perfectly in control. We don't even define infertility until 12 months afterwards. But it doesn't take 12 months for this couple who was holding off on a child to want that to exist. So I do think there are times when people rush to interventional treatments. They rush to infertility treatments because it hasn't occurred as quickly as they wanted it to occur. And what drives that is the control. The same control that says, not now, we're not going to have a child, is the one that says, okay, let's flip that switch. We're ready right now.
It's not as if overcoming infertility, helping a couple have a child, isn't something good. This is a great good. The church sympathizes with couples who find themselves infertile. But the church is also going to say, though, as the guardian of the dignity of the person, that there are some technologies that actually harm the human person and harm the persons themselves who are engaged in this technology. But the church is 100% behind efforts to overcome these kinds of problems.
The process of in vitro fertilization removes the interpersonal expression of love and harms the dignity of the child. In addition to these moral issues, there are numerous concerns from a medical point of view.
When the birth control pill came out, that was in 1960. And it was hailed as a great contraceptive and and it was always pushed as a contraceptive initially. But then there were a whole variety of conditions in women's health that doctors didn't know how to manage. It included severe menstrual cramps, it included recurrent ovarian cysts, involved different types of cycles that have abnormal bleeding involved, conditions such as endometriosis and others. So there's quite a long list actually of things. And so they started giving women the pill. And the cramps weren't as bad, and the bleeding kind of disappeared, but it was all symptomatic. They didn't know what was going on, but they had something that they could treat it with for symptom-wise, make people think they're better. As soon as they stop the pill, all those symptoms and signs come back again. Well, with IVF, I mean, when that came along, they were already doing this with birth control pills, ignoring what the underlying problems were. And so the switch was, in that sense, wasn't very difficult or complex. It was easy to do.
It was presented as our only option, and the process itself was very clinical, obviously very expensive, and scary and unnatural.
with IVF, it felt more like a business. I mean, it was simply, you go in there, they're there to make money. That is their goal. You know, they're honestly probably could care less whether or not you conceive. You know, the more times we try to conceive through them, the more money they make.
The fertility industry is really, it's sort of like a wild, wild west scenario where there really isn't a lot of regulations in terms of what they do. And so you've seen, you know, over the years, calls for the fertility industry to be regulated.
One of the statistics that is the most remarkable about in vitro fertilization, and I think says the whole question maybe the best, there are 9.5 million women in the United States who have some type of fertility-related problem. Of that group of women, it's a large number, less than 0.5% of them will have a baby this year by IVF. That's how, in a way, inefficient it is.
I think the success rate we got was 25% chance of even getting pregnant and maybe a 25% chance of carrying it.
This whole science, and I'm beginning to think of it almost as a pseudoscience, because the biggest numbers they're looking at are their checkbook. It's painted a picture that makes it sound like this is just the greatest thing in the world, and yet they are totally underserving this group of women who have real diseases, and so it's no wonder in a way that their overall outreach to women with fertility is so low.
When babies are conceived through in vitro fertilization, first of all, we have to understand that generally there's between 4 to 12 embryos that are created, because it's the chance of success is fairly low, even in the best of clinics. The highest is around 35%, and those are the ones that have the highest success rate. So what you're doing is you're creating a new little human being in a petri dish, and then you have 12. Well, usually they implant maybe 3 to 4 of these embryos, because it doesn't happen that it works very often. So you're trying to maximize your rate of success. Then what do you do with the leftovers? Well, sometimes you just dispose of them. Sometimes they are just flushed down the drain or disposed of in some way. Other times you freeze them. You freeze these new little embryos because they might be useful in some future enterprise. So now the church understands that each little fertilized ovum is really a new little human being, tiny little human being. And people will say, well, it doesn't look very human. I say, well, what's a human being supposed to look like in the first couple hours, the first couple days of their life? Do you just want a miniature human being, or just like anything else? It's going to look quite different. The seed is going to look different from the adult version. So you have these new little human beings, and you're implanting them in the mother's uterus. And not very many of them will take. So already you may be 3 of those. 3 of the 4 may die, all 4 may die. So you've created new life just to let that new life die.
There also are issues if you implant a whole bunch of eggs, because they all may take, and then you have several children who could be born, or you have to go through something that they call a reduction abortion, where you go in and somewhat randomly select which children you're going to abort.
If nobody explained to us truly how it worked, that they are, you know, basically making babies in a dish. Some of them get thrown away, some of them work, some of them don't, and who cares? Now write us a check, you know, that's...
And once we found that out, that I just broke my heart, because we
were very thankful we
didn't do it, because I couldn't imagine just throwing my own baby away.
You're talking about women and their husbands who desperately want this baby. These are wanted children, and abortion becomes part of the solution. It just doesn't connect.
The more you learn about IVF, the more apparent it becomes why the church stands so strongly against it. But even with all these reasons, IVF remains popular.
What would be the answer to the question, if it was placed before a group of lay people, what's the best treatment for infertility? Oh, I guess it'd be in vitro fertilization, IVF, whatever. And the only reason they think that is because That's what we've been led to believe by the media. Whenever there's a big multiple pregnancy rate, like a quintuplets or sextuplets or like the octuplets, I mean, it gets massive public publicity, you know, through the morning shows and this sort of thing on television. And so you come away with the idea that this is really almost the only treatment for infertility.
Well, I think, in my opinion, it was the one that is on TV all the time. That's the one the press talks about. I had never heard of any other potential methods.
You ask anybody about infertility and it's, you need to go see a fertility specialist, and that all the fertility specialists we ran into, all they did was IVF. I mean, they didn't give us any other option.
There are the ways to do this that are actually more effective, and they're more consistent with what the underlying problems might be.
When people start to go through it, they have no idea what the steps are along the way. And so as they go through this, you start off with some very benign, minor testing, and then gradually you go a little further, a little further, a little further, and before you know it, you're saying, wow, we've spent $6,000. Do I want to spend the rest of this that's necessary for me to go through this because my insurance doesn't cover it? And you say, well, we've come this far. Perhaps we should go a little bit further. And I think the same thing occurs morally. If you don't think about it ahead of time, you don't think about the moral challenges you're going to face down the road, you're gradually getting there. And then at some point you say, wow, I've come this far. If I only do this last thing, I can have the child I want. So I don't think people think about the totality of what infertility workup and treatment means.
Due to its popularity, IVF is often seen as the primary solution to infertility. This provides profit to the clinics providing the treatment, but it often dissuades couples from learning about their options. One alternative, NaProTECHNOLOGY, allows people to address their infertility struggle in a way that follows the teachings of the Catholic Church.
First of all, NaProTECHNOLOGY is a women's health science that involves the evaluation and treatment of a whole variety of conditions, not just infertility. But it does have a natural inclination for the treatment of infertility and repetitive miscarriages. It's a program that we developed based on research that we were doing with a natural family planning system called the Creighton Model Fertility Care System. This is a system of charting that we teach women to do so that they can understand not only their menstrual cycle but also their fertility cycle. And with that information, as we began teaching people to do this and evaluating it and monitoring it and following it and tracking it, we began to see that there were certain types of conditions that had abnormalities associated with it that weren't typical.
It's letting your...
Basically figuring out how your body is working. In particular, you know, not a generalization of how female works, or, you know, this is how your particular body is working. So they can pinpoint, you know, if there is a problem, what needs to be remedied.
In NaProTECHNOLOGY, we're not only improving fertility, but we're treating all of these underlying disease processes, which is really important because these are ultimately infertility is a result of an underlying disease. And it's not like maybe 1 out of 3 cases, but it's like 3 out of 3 cases. They all have some underlying disease.
We seem to have a little more control over the process, or maybe a lot more control over the process, because we're both involved in it and doing the tracking, and we knew that Dr. Hildreth was trying to get to the root of the problem and not bypass some issues.
It just reminded me of how a doctor actually should be, you know, always with you and
walking you
through each step, telling you why we're doing it and why we need to have these tests and what your what your test results should show, and why, and figuring out why they're not showing that.
There's a lot of reasons they should consider NaProTECHNOLOGY. First of all, they will find out what is causing their infertility. Secondly, they will get those problems solved and treated adequately. I don't mean covered up, I mean treated. Thirdly, the pregnancy rate overall is significantly higher on a per woman basis. And so if you want success, NaProTECHNOLOGY is up to 3 times more successful than IVF is. And then finally, it's less expensive. I mean, these are real diseases we're talking about, and even though the insurance industry kind of doesn't like to deal with some of these issues, We've forced the issue a lot over the last 20 or 30 years, and we've finally got many of them to realize that these are real diseases and they need to be treated. And even if surgery is involved, the insurance will reimburse much of the cost. So overall, it's a lot cheaper.
It's almost amazing.
Yeah, we just
After every other doctor that wouldn't even weren't taking things into consideration. All they cared was just that simple little fix called IVF that they can do, instead of truly figuring out the root cause of why we weren't getting pregnant.
Yeah, I think our only really regret is that we didn't hear about Dr. Hilger's 5 years sooner.
In NaProTECHNOLOGY, we respect the dignity of women and we respect the integrity of marriage. Those two things, that says a lot about it, really.
After trying for so long, it was probably, how long had it been, like 6 years, and then after going to Dr. Hilger's, and it happened within a month, it was just almost like a miracle, because we virtually felt we had tried almost everything, and then to stumble upon him in an RCIA meeting and then have this happen in a month, it was like a miracle.
In addition to being a more successful infertility solution, NaProTECHNOLOGY allows couples to work through infertility struggles while still upholding the values of the Church. Once you consider the teachings of the Church, it's clear that in vitro fertilization is not the simple solution that some might initially believe. But when a couple is desperate to have a baby, emotions can get in the way of making carefully considered decisions.
You might ask, like, what should these couples do who are struggling with infertility? What's the best thing for them to respond to their own situation? What does the Church teach? Well, the Church certainly teaches that infertility is a cross. Right? It's something that's difficult. To desperately want a child is a very natural thing for a couple. And that if you're struggling with infertility, the Church would certainly say to pray about it, right? To ask God to give you wisdom and insight on how to deal with this. And for any Catholic, that certainly means trying to understand the Church's teaching, to read Donum Vitae and Dignitas Personae, to talk to a priest, to talk to couples who have lived in accord with the Church's teaching, who also struggle with infertility but haven't gone the path of in vitro fertilization, artificial insemination. And then to figure out what God is really calling you to. Parenthood can be exercised in many different ways, and just because you can't have biological children of your own doesn't mean that there aren't many paths that you can satisfy that desire. There's all sorts of possibilities that people need to explore. They may find that they want to be just very involved with uncles or aunts. They might want to be very involved in being coaches and running organizations that involve children. An obsession with a biological child of your own, again, it indicates an unwillingness to carry a cross that God may have given you. It's a very natural desire to want that, but when you can't have what you want, whether it's a spouse or a child or a job or an education or a house, when you can't get it, you have to step back and say, this must be a cross I'm meant to carry. And to try to just step up and do that. Find another way to meet that desire, a moral way to meet that desire.
Although struggling with infertility is a major challenge, learning more about the realities of in vitro fertilization helps you understand why the Church has taken a strong stance against it. IVF uses technology to engineer a process that should be between a husband, a wife, and God. If you or someone you know is struggling with infertility, look towards the Church and God to find the answers. This film is made possible by a grant from Our Sunday Visitor.